Okay, so in Romans chapter 9, in verses, let's say, 10 through 13, we have a very clear teaching of unconditional election for salvation and unconditional election for damnation. Now, many people who are non-Calvinists, when they look at these verses, what they try to do is take the quotes that are from the Old Testament, they're from Genesis and Malachi, and they try to go to these chapters and somehow get from those texts that there's a different concept that's actually being talked about than what Romans 9 could potentially on the surface lead you to believe. Now, I want to demonstrate from actually going to these texts in the Old Testament and then also sticking with Romans 9 that there's a beautiful consistency of really everything that's there. And people are just abusing these texts from Genesis and Malachi. But in Genesis 25 here, it says in verse 23, "And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb." And of course, this is talking about Jacob and Esau, how they are twins. So I have no issue with somebody pointing out that in Genesis 25, when it's talking about the elder shall serve the younger, yeah, absolutely, 2 nations. We're talking about the nation of Israel versus the nation of Edom, or I guess in a looser sense, the nation of Esau. So I got no issue with that. I would just simply point out that it is true at the same time that the person Esau served his younger brother Jacob, and the nation of Israel, or I should say the nation of Edom, served the nation of Israel. Both are true, and it's really because of the headship of these nations, the way that played out in the personal lives of Jacob and Esau. Similar related experiences happen to their descendants. That's just the way God works. He has a head of a nation be indicative of his descendants. And again, it's not to say that there's never any exception to how a father could be different from a son. Like, obviously that can exist, but as a whole, at least when it comes to Israel and Edom, there are parallels to what their fathers did, what Jacob and Esau did, and then what happened in the lives of their descendants in their nations. So, I just want to point out also that when it says like the elder shall serve the younger, well, we actually find that in Genesis 25. And it's, let's see here. I'd say from verse 29, let's start. So, "And Jacob sowed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. And Jacob said, Sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me? And Jacob said, Swear to me this day. And he sware to him. And he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and did drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright." So this is where Esau, the person, served Jacob, the person, his brother. Esau served him by selling his birthright to him. It's very clear in the situation who got the best end of the stick, if you will. Clearly, Jacob got something immensely more valuable than Esau did. Esau got ripped off, and he allowed it to be. He caused his own downfall when it comes to this matter, you know. So yes, it's very true that Esau served Jacob the person. I mean, this is like, I don't understand why anybody doesn't see this. They're just not recognizing what's happening, but that is what's happening. This is how Esau served Jacob. And yes, when it comes to the nations thing, yeah, there's times when, or there's at least a time in the Old Testament where the nation serves Israel, where Edom serves Israel. So yeah, that's, no one's denied that happened, but again, it's all in accordance with what happened with their fathers, the individuals. So, and then we go to Malachi 1, because this is often viewed as like nations is what's going on here. It is to a point, but in another sense, no, it's not. So I just want to get into that. So Malachi 1, verse 1, the burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. I have loved you, saith the Lord, yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord? Yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau, and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. Whereas Edom saith, we are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, they shall build, but I will throw down. And they shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom the Lord hath indignation forever. Okay, so in verse 1 we're told who the book of Malachi is addressed to. It's addressed to the nation of Israel, which is a large group of individuals, but at the same time, each individual in that nation is being addressed. This is God's words for every individual in the nation. And then it says, I have loved you, that's plural, saith the Lord, yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? So God's going to, well, Israel is saying, how have you loved us? And then God's going to answer, was not Esau Jacob's brother? Saith the Lord, yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau. Okay. How, if this is getting at nations, if it says, when it says Esau, was not Esau Jacob's brother, the Esau and Jacob is now like nations? Now, again, I understand that in verse 4, it says, whereas Edom saith, and yes, that is the nation collectively talking, but hang on a second. Wherein hast thou loved us was not Esau Jacob's brother. Like, he's talking to Israel, and then God's saying, was not Esau Jacob's brother. So, of course, he's talking about the individuals here. That's what verse 2 is definitely about. Because otherwise, if he's not referring to Esau and Jacob as individuals, he really should be saying, are not you Esau's brother? Or really it should be, is not Edom your brother? Like, that's what it would really need to say for that plurality to be more, to actually be what's being addressed. But here we have the group of the nation of Israel is being addressed, and he's calling back to their history of, was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord, yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau, and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons in the wilderness. So here in verse 3 is kind of where I guess some are dismissing what's really happening in verse 2, because, yeah, from what I can understand, Esau, the person, like, in his lifetime, it does not appear that his mountains and his heritage were laid waste for the dragons of the wilderness in his personal lifetime. But I would just simply say that what's happening is God is just simply starting to transition us. So Esau. So if it is true that Esau only basically had a life of prosperity, if you will, in his lifetime, and then later in his descendants, things were laid waste for the dragons of the wilderness. Yeah, I mean, I see where that's coming from, but I would just say that verse 2 is very clear that we're dealing with individuals, and clearly God loved the individual Jacob, and in verse 2 he hated the individual Esau. And then his mountains and his heritage were laid waste for the dragons of the wilderness. And I would also just say, like, the land that Jacob has versus what Esau has, it still is land that like belongs to them, even though they passed away. And I understand from perspective, like if one's in heaven and one's in hell, or even if you took the position that both are in heaven, Esau and Jacob, then is the land on earth really theirs? Well, yeah, because it's named after them. So again, it's a little bit confusing from that perspective, but I would just simply point out that as a general statement, the land of Israel is Israel's, meaning it belongs to the person Jacob, just as much as it belongs to the individuals that are in that nation and his descendants. So, yeah, I just want to point out. So in verse 1 of Malachi 1, we're talking about Israel as a nation, hence addressed to all the individuals in that nation. Verse 2, talking about the individual of Esau and Jacob, who are brothers. One's loved, one's hated. And then in verse 3, we are still referring to the individual Esau, but we're starting to transition to the group, the collective, his descendants, the nation. Anyway, I hope that's a help for the Malachi part. But what I do want to also point out is in Romans 9, a lot of times when people are looking at this, they're flipping back to these other Old Testament passages, but they're not considering what Romans 9 actually has to say, regardless of who you think is being addressed. Do you think it's individuals only? Do you think it's nations only? Or do you think, like I do, that it's very clearly both is what's happening? The individuals and the nations. Both are completely relevant, completely applicable to what's happening. So some people go to these Old Testament passages, then try to bring interpretation from there and back into Romans 9. But the reality is, Romans chapter 9 is going to be the best place to understand Romans 9. Because Paul is developing a very clear train of thought, a thought that continues to develop, comes to a conclusion. He's laying out the case as a lawyer, and you have to let him define his terms, let him use his text the way he sees fit, to come to the conclusions that he does that are inspired of God. Well, every word of God in Romans 9 is inspired, of course. So, in Romans 9:11, so actually I'm going to start with verse 10. And not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one, even by her father Isaac, for the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth, it was said unto her, the elder shall serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. So, what some do is, because they think the two nations from Genesis 25 gives them an out, and then somehow just, this is God, hating one nation, loving another. But what they're failing to do is recognize what Romans 9 is saying, that it's unconditionally hated one, unconditionally loved another, because for the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth. Because simply put, if you have these children, Jacob and Esau, born, and they had done good or evil, then the purpose of God according to election would not stand, because then it would be of works instead of him that calleth. So it cannot be because of doing anything good or anything bad. It has to be purely according to the purpose of God, according to election. In other words, God's choice of what he wants to do and what he will do, and absolutely will do. So, regardless of who you think Jacob and Esau is in Romans 9:12 and Romans 9:13, if you think it's two nations, okay, well, he unconditionally hated Esau. He unconditionally hated Edom. And for Jacob, he unconditionally loved them. So, one is going to have mercy, one is going to have wrath, one is a vessel of honor, one is a vessel of dishonor, one is a child of the flesh, one is a child of God, one is a child of promise. There's a constant duality in Romans 9 of, those who are saved, those who are lost, those who have mercy, those who are hardened. Those, who God prepares for glory, others whom he's prepared and fitted for destruction. So, hope that's a help. Malachi 1, beautifully fits to understanding that Jacob and Esau are persons individually. Of course, I think it's also relevant in the group context, but I think primarily Esau and Jacob are individuals that are in view. And that's also what Paul understands in Romans 9. Because he goes on to say, for he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. And then, like verse 16, so that it is not of him, an individual, not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God that sheweth mercy. So, hope this was a help to anybody who hasn't quite connected how Romans 9 works in relation to these other Old Testament passages. And I guess it's just one other thing I want to point out. So, for those who think Jacob and Esau are just not at all referring to the individual Jacob and the individual Esau, those persons as men, just look at, again, verse 10 and 11. But when Rebekah also had conceived by one, even by her father Isaac, for the children being not yet born. The context is these two individuals in Rebekah's womb having not been born. So, it's really clear. It is both the individuals and perfectly applicable to the nations as well in a general sense. Of course, there's a remnant of Israel that, believes the gospel right, and there's going to be there is and has been and will be a remnant of Edom who believes, but, by and large, there's corporate purposes that apply individually according to unconditional election. All right, take care.